No one expected him to say it, but he did. In that instant, the entire forum seemed to freeze, as if every breath in the room had been pulled into a single, stunned silence. Stage lights washed over the crowd, catching wide eyes, parted lips, and hands instinctively rising with phones ready to capture history. Ron Johnson's voice still hung in the air, trembling faintly, as though even he wasn't fully prepared for what had just left his mouth. Across the stage, Jasmine Crockett blinked once, slow and deliberate, her expression torn between disbelief and the steady composure that had carried her through far harsher moments. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. A low murmur began to ripple through the audience, unsure whether to gasp, laugh, or erupt. And yet, this was only the beginning. Johnson's face tightened with a conflict he couldn't hide, an uneasy mix of pride, fear, and something that looked almost like release. The room felt suspended between two futures, each waiting for someone to claim it. The path to that collision was marked by tension, doubt, and simmering resolve. But to understand why this moment shattered the room, you have to know what led up to it. America had been running on fumes long before the forum lights flickered on. Families were worn down, communities were on edge. Every headline felt like another reminder that the country was stretched thin, pulled apart by arguments no one seemed willing to end. Across kitchen tables, in crowded buses, on late-night shifts, people whispered the same quiet plea. Someone, anyone, needs to cut through the noise. Jasmine Crockett's peace proposal arrived into that exhausted atmosphere like a spark in a dry field. Brilliant to some, dangerous to others, and impossible to ignore. Supporters praised its clarity and compassion, calling it the kind of leadership missing from Washington for far too long. Critics dismissed it as naive, unrealistic, even threatening to the status quo. What was meant to heal instead became another battleground, its intentions wrapped in layers of fear, admiration, projection, and misunderstanding. By the time the forum was announced, the stakes had already risen far beyond policy. It became a stage for a country desperate to see whether dialogue could still matter. Networks teased it as must-watch. Online debates spiraled with every leaked detail. Everyone watching sensed something was about to break open. And sitting at the center of that anticipation were two figures whose paths had collided before, each carrying their own history, their own scars, their own convictions about what America should become. For some viewers, the event promised redemption. For others, it threatened humiliation. But nearly all agreed on one thing. Whatever happened that night wouldn't stay confined to the walls of that forum. Tension crackled in the air, thick enough that even viewers at home felt it pressing against their chests, urging them to lean closer and hold their breath now. What no one realized was how much the past would haunt the stage that night. Ron Johnson had long been a figure people watched with equal parts frustration and fascination. To some, he represented the stubborn certainty of an older political era. To others, he embodied an unyielding force that refused to bend, even when the world around him shifted. Over the years, he became known for sharp retorts, clipped interviews, and moments that ricocheted across social media faster than he could explain them. Clips of him pushing back against proposals he deemed unrealistic were replayed endlessly, each one fueling a growing sense that Johnson thrived on confrontation more than compromise. a cinematic montage of his most talked-about moments lived rent-free in the public imagination, a raised eyebrow that instantly became a meme, an exasperated gesture replayed on late-night shows, a curt dismissal that pundits dissected for days. None of these moments defined him completely, but each added another layer to the aura surrounding him, an aura of someone who was dug in, immovable, and ready for the next clash without hesitation. Op-eds often painted him as a man allergic to sweeping visions of peace, joking that the quickest way to provoke him was to attach the word idealistic to any bill. Even supporters acknowledged he could seem brusque, while critics insisted he delighted in shutting down proposals before hearing them out. His past critiques of sweeping peace frameworks became part of his brand, woven into debates, interviews, and headlines that rarely gave him room for nuance. So when the forum was announced, many assumed Johnson would arrive primed for another verbal battle. Commentators framed him as the immovable object to Crockett's rising momentum. Viewers expected sparks, interruptions, maybe even eye rolls visible from the back row. He loomed as the closest thing the narrative had to an antagonist, not malicious, but steadfast in a way that made confrontation feel inevitable. And yet, beneath that hardened exterior, something quieter had been taken shape, a thought he hadn't shared, a shift he hadn't voiced, a truth he hadn't tested in public. And yet, what no one knew was that Johnson had been carrying a secret, something that would flip the room upside down. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in the halls of Congress or in front of cameras. It began in a neighborhood where strength was measured not by how loudly someone spoke, but by how much weight they carried quietly. She grew up watching people she loved navigate systems stacked against them. Every setback became a lesson, every small victory a spark. Long before she ever drafted a policy, she learned that peace was not the absence of struggle, it was the courage to confront it with dignity. As a child, she absorbed the world with wide, unflinching eyes. She saw neighbors lose opportunities because no one would stand up for them. She saw families stretched thin by forces they never chose. But she also saw resilience, women who refused to bow, men who worked 2 jobs and still managed to mentor kids on the block. Those were her first teachers, the people who shaped her understanding of justice long before she knew the word for it. When she stepped into her first courtroom as a young attorney, she carried those memories like armor. Critics underestimated her immediately. Too young, too outspoken, too unwilling to accept the standard path laid out before her. But her first victory proved what she had known since childhood. Clarity and purpose were stronger than doubt. She didn't just win cases. She restored a sense of possibility to people who'd grown used to being ignored. Her rise in public service followed the same pattern. She walked into rooms knowing some people doubted her, but she focused only on the work. She fought for those who rarely saw their stories reflected in policy. She listened when others talked over her. She built bridges when others burned them. And with every step forward, her influence grew, not because she chased it, but because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. So when she unveiled her peace plan, it wasn't a political maneuver. It was the culmination of everything she'd lived, the struggle she witnessed, the injustices she confronted, the belief that dignity should never be negotiable. The plan carried pieces of her community, her past, and the countless voices that shaped her into someone willing to challenge a system that too often rewarded division. And this is exactly why what happened next felt impossible. The debate began with polite tension, the kind people could still pretend wasn't there, but it didn't take long before the air thickened into something sharper. Johnson leaned forward in his chair, eyebrows narrowed, voice carrying the edge of someone who felt the ground shifting beneath him. He dissected Crockett's peace plan line by line, framing each question like a challenge, each comment like a warning shot. His sentences came fast, clipped, rehearsed, but threaded with frustration. Crockett didn't flinch. She met every critique with a steady calm that unnerved him more than any argument could. While Johnson's fingers tapped impatiently against his notepad, hers remained still, folded gently, as if she refused to let the rising tension dictate her presence. The contrast grew clearer with each exchange. His agitation versus her clarity, his raised volume versus her measured tone. The audience felt it. They shifted in their seats, trading looks that betrayed a mix of excitement and unease. A few murmurs rippled through the room when Johnson interrupted, louder than necessary. The moderator tried to steady the pace, but the debate had already taken on a momentum of its own. Crockett answered each pointed remark without breaking cadence, her voice carrying a softness that somehow hit harder than any confrontation. Johnson's frustration began to show at the edges, a tight jaw, a fleeting grimace, eyes darting across the audience as if searching for confirmation that he still held the upper hand. But Crockett stayed composed, steadying the rhythm of the room with each response. Even her pauses felt deliberate, grounding the crowd in a way Johnson couldn't replicate. People leaned forward, sensing the collision building between them. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Johnson's voice sharpened one moment, softened the next, as though he couldn't decide whether he was arguing with her or with something unsettled inside himself. Crockett remained unwavering, each answer nudging the debate toward an invisible tipping point. The forum lights felt hotter. The silence between exchanges grew heavier. Something was coming, and everyone in the room felt it closing in, inch by inch. And then, at the height of tension, the moment arrived. She rose slowly, as though the weight of the entire moment had gathered at her shoulders, and the room reacted instinctively, leaning in as one. Crockett stepped forward in a kind of slow motion, the lights pooling around her like a spotlight that had been waiting all night for permission to shine. Johnson's last challenge still echoed faintly in the air, sharp and unresolved, but she didn't match its force. Instead, she inhaled once, exhaled once, and let the silence wrap around her. The crowd seemed suspended, caught between anticipation and uncertainty, waiting for her to decide what direction the night would take. She paused just long enough for the room to stop breathing. Then she began, not with statistics or jargon, but with a story that pulled the tension downward into something more raw and human. She talked about a mother she'd represented early in her legal career, a woman juggling 2 jobs, raising 3 children, and trying to shield them from a world that often refused to see their innocence. Crockett described the exhaustion etched into the woman's face, the fear, the fragile hope. Suddenly, the debate wasn't academic. It was personal, immediate, undeniable. As she spoke, something shifted. The audience, restless moments earlier, settled into an almost reverent quiet. Johnson straightened in his chair, the line between skepticism and curiosity beginning to blur across his expression. Crockett moved from the story to the data, weaving the two together with deliberate precision. How community-led initiatives reduced violence, how restorative programs broke cycles before they hardened into tragedy, how peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of opportunity. She made the case that her plan wasn't idealistic fantasy, it was the logical extension of lived experience and proven solutions. Johnson opened his mouth to interject, but something in her tone stopped him. It wasn't forceful, but it carried a clarity that pressed gently against his defenses. She pivoted to the cost of inaction, how communities fractured, how families paid the price, how unresolved harm ricocheted for generations. And then she did something he didn't expect. She acknowledged his concerns, Not dismissively, not strategically, but sincerely. The admission disarmed him. His shoulders eased. For the first time that night, he wasn't preparing a rebuttal. He was listening, truly listening, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Crockett stepped closer, closing the final inches of distance between them without crowding the moment. Her voice softened, carrying a quiet conviction that seemed to hum against the walls. She outlined the final pillar of her plan: community partnerships that empowered local leaders rather than imposing outside mandates. She framed it as a blueprint built from the ground up, from stories like the one she'd shared, from data that had been ignored for too long. She paused just long enough for the room to stop breathing again, letting the truth of her words settle over everyone. Johnson's face shifted again, a flicker of something unguarded passing through his expression. Doubt, reflection, maybe even recognition. He looked down at his notes, then at the audience, then back at Crockett, as if pieces of a puzzle he'd held for years were suddenly rearranging themselves. The crowd felt the tension tilt. A few people whispered, one person gasped softly, and for the first time in the entire debate, Johnson didn't seem prepared to challenge her. He seemed prepared to consider her. The debate stage, once a battlefield, transformed into something far more fragile. And then it happened, the moment it would replay across the country for days. Johnson rose, slowly, almost uncertainly, as if pulled upward by something beyond pride or calculation. The room went silent. Crockett didn't move. He cleared his throat once, eyes fixed on the floor before lifting them to meet hers. And with a steadiness no one expected, he said the words that detonated through the room. He endorsed her plan. No caveats, no hesitation, just a simple, disarming declaration of support that cracked the night open. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The silence wasn't empty. It was stunned, electric, heavy with the realization that something irreversible had just occurred. Then the eruption came. Cheers thundered through the forum like a wave breaking free after years of restraint. People stood, some with hands over their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Crockett remained still, absorbing the moment with the quiet strength that had carried her there. Johnson looked both lighter and more burdened, as if truth had cost him something he'd never admit. But outside the room, the shockwaves traveled even faster. In minutes, whispers became posts, posts became headlines, and headlines became firestorms of speculation. The moment had leapt beyond the walls, rewriting expectations in real time, and setting the stage for consequences no one in that forum could predict ahead. The moment Johnson endorsed Crockett's plan didn't just stay inside the forum. It detonated across the country with the speed of a spark landing on dry leaves. Within minutes, phones everywhere buzzed with alerts. A clipped video of the exchange, barely 20 seconds long, shot to the top of every feed. People replayed it in disbelief, pausing on Johnson's expression, on Crockett's calm stillness, on the stunned reaction of the audience behind them. The hashtags appeared almost instantly. Hashtag Johnson Flip, hashtag Crockett Effect, hashtag Peace Plan Now. Mock tweets filled the night. Did Ron Johnson just join the collective healing era? Plot twist of the century. I need a wellness check on his comms team. Even supportive ones carried a note of awe. This is what leadership looks like. Crockett didn't raise her voice once. Power. A screenshot of Johnson standing beside Crockett, their silhouettes outlined by the stage lights, spread faster than anyone could trace. Cable networks scrambled to cut into their programming, anchors speaking with a slightly breathless tone reserved for bewildering political upsets. One news ticker cycled repeatedly. Senate Johnson publicly backs Crockett peace framework. Allies scramble for response. Commentators tried to make sense of it, some calling it courage, others calling it confusion, and a few insisting it had to be a misunderstanding destined to be walked back before sunrise. Johnson's usual allies reacted with disbelief that bordered on chaos. Some demanded clarification, others issued carefully worded statements that said nothing while revealing everything. Meanwhile, Crockett supporters flooded the internet with celebration. Dancers in living rooms, students cheering in dorm halls, activists quoting her lines with captions like, "This is why representation matters." Even a few public figures chimed in, posting that rare mix of admiration and surprise that only moments like this could summon. But beneath the noise, something quieter stirred. A deeper conversation began to ripple, people asking what it meant for someone so entrenched to shift, even slightly. Comment threads turned reflective. Families debated it over dinner. Teachers brought it up in morning classes. Communities long ignored felt seen, even if just for a night. The moment had cracked open not just the forum, but the country's sense of what was possible. And yet, beyond the noise, a deeper truth had emerged. In the aftermath of the forum, as the country tried to make sense of what it had witnessed, one truth rose above every headline. Dignity still carries power. Crockett hadn't won the moment by force, volume, or spectacle. She had done it with clarity, with purpose, with the quiet courage to speak from a place deeper than politics. When someone speaks with truth, even those who oppose them feel it. That was the shift everyone felt ripple through the room. Unexpected, undeniable, and profoundly human. People across the country recognized that what unfolded wasn't merely a political surprise. It was a reminder of what empathy can do when allowed to breathe. Crockett's story, her reasoning, her unwavering steadiness, these elements reached past ideology and touched something older and stronger. Unity doesn't demand agreement, it demands the willingness to hear one another. And in that forum, for a fleeting but unforgettable moment, two leaders stood on common ground, not because they were the same, but because they dared to listen. That courage to cross lines, to crack open long-sealed assumptions, is what gave the moment its lasting weight. Johnson's decision didn't erase his past positions, nor did it demand that anyone forget them, but it proved that change is possible even in the most unlikely corners of public life. And for many watching, especially those who had grown tired of a country locked in endless clashes, the moment felt like a small opening in a wall that once seemed unbreakable. That opening mattered because it reminded people that justice and decency are not abstract ideals, but daily choices, shaped by voices willing to rise above fear. Crockett demonstrated that strength is not measured by domination, but by conviction. Her calm defied the noise. Her story softened hardened expectations. And Johnson's response, however unexpected, showed that even the most rigid armor can fracture when confronted with sincerity. In a country yearning for signs of shared humanity, their exchange became a beacon. Its impact spread further than anyone in that room could have predicted. Moments like this remind us that peace is not naive, it's necessary. That night will be remembered not just for the shock, but for the undeniable beauty of what unfolded. The moment Ron Johnson endorsed Jasmine Crockett's plan, the breathless silence that followed, and the eruption of hope that filled the room like a rising tide. It wasn't just a political twist, it was a reminder that courage can come from unexpected places, and that dignity, when spoken clearly, can move even the most unlikely voices. If you believe in moments like this, don't just watch. Join the community. Add your voice to the momentum. Share this story with someone who needs to feel that spark again. Subscribe, stay connected, and be part of a movement built on clarity, compassion, and the belief that we're capable of more than division. Together, we can carry this moment forward. Together, we can keep building what comes next.